Niin telvisi Jibet Stevens, Leo ja Sony. Nyt chewiji peju sibnik det. Wajadibnik manigowisk. Hello, my name is Jibet Stevens, and I'm from Eskasoni First Nation, and my parents were from Maligwach. Oh, I've always loved it here. I don't come back as often as I should, but I've always loved it here.
Maligwach, an ancient Mi'kmaq community, abandoned in the 1940s when the federal government enacted a policy called centralization to relocate Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia.
Psychologically, spiritually, we have not recovered from that yet.
You know, it's a dark history that can't be just put under the rug.
We were concentrating on what happened to centralization. Why weren't the native people compensated somehow? Maybe we should resurrect it.
Centralization, a little-known chapter in Canadian history, a social experiment, and one that failed. The Eskasoni First Nation is a 40-minute drive from Sydney, Cape Breton, along a windy road. The reserve is nestled between the hills and the scenic Bredor Lakes. Jibet Stevens was born here, but both of her parents were from Maligwach.
They were forced to move, and they were only allowed one bag each, or one suitcase. And they were piled into the back of a pickup truck, and it took most of the day to get to Eskasoni. Yeah, this is their picture right there. They felt like outsiders. They felt like they weren't welcome. It was difficult for them. And my father used to say, I never liked Eskasoni. You know, we were forced to come here. It wasn't a place that we chose. They had their love for Maligwach, where they were born and raised, and that's where they always wanted to go back to.
Eskasoni is the largest Mi'kmaq community, home to 4,500 people today. Before centralization, just 22 families lived here.
Good day.
Stevens visits nearby elder Ethel Johnson, a skilled basket maker in Eskasoni.
So I sell these, I make a little, my mother made this one, look at that. So I made that long time.
She moved here as a young child with her parents.
They heard on the radio about centralization. They were going to get 8-room houses, where we're going to have all the facilities we wanted, where we're going to have schools, we're going to have running water, and etc., etc., etc. So it sounded good.
Indian Affairs set up a lumber mill on reserve and promised jobs, health care, and housing. The reality?
They lived in tents, you know, all winter, with the snow flying, and some of them, the houses were started, but they were just shelves. You know, they had walls, roof. They moved into those, and they were cold. So you just had to make do with what was there.
Harsh conditions through cold winters, it's a story echoed by other elders in the community.
Earliest memories, family lived in a tent. That's my earliest memory. No electric lights. We didn't have electric lights. No telephone.
George Syllaboy's grandfather was a prominent Mi'kmaq leader, Gabriel Syllaboy, the Grand Chief of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. He seemed to support centralization at first, and the promise of better living conditions.
No, he didn't talk much about that. But he didn't like the white people.
He didn't like white people, you said?
No.
Did he ever say why?
No. Well, he said he took all my land. That's what he said. And he wasn't scared to say it, huh?
today, I hope that you will accept, and your ancestors will accept, and your families will accept, and the Mi'kmaq people will accept my deepest apologies.
In 2017, the government of Nova Scotia apologized and pardoned the Grand Chief, who was convicted of hunting charges in 1928. Syliboy had argued he had a treaty right to hunt and fish, but lost in court. The judge referred to the Mi'kmaq as uncivilized people or savages. In a 1943 letter to Indian Affairs, another Mi'kmaq leader took issue with the minister's view of Indians regarding drunkenness, lawlessness, and illegitimacy. Chief Ben Christmas fought against the relocation policy created by Indian Affairs in an era of racism.
Then centralization was, let's get rid of some of our problems, the reserves. And let's isolate these two communities, Shubenacadie and Eskasoni. They were far enough away from the cities.
Don Julian is the executive director for the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq.
There's people who believe that the federal government were taking care of us for a long time. But here in Nova Scotia, and even the Atlantic provinces, the money that derived from the sale of Indian reserve lands, and what was there to take care of the old and infirmed? Everybody else sort of had a job. Hunting, fishing, people did work.
The Mi'kmaq in this 1936 film lived in southwest Nova Scotia. They harvested porpoises, ate the meat, and sold the oil in the nearby town of Digby. Though the market for porpoise oil declined as petroleum products became popular, the Mi'kmaq were self-sufficient. But by the 1940s, the families in this film were forced to relocate.
And it was just after during centralization when people began depending on the federal government for a way of life, is when it changed.
The happiest part of my life would have been here in Eskasoni prior to residential school, because here we were able to live off the land.
Albert Marshall lived in Eskasoni before centralization.
That's when our culture really took a good bang, because prior to that, money was not really our main economy. So this concept of a grocery store and losing the ability to provide through hunting and gathering really created a very profound impact on us. Hunger, frustration was so powerful that a lot of us eventually succumbed to some form of a self-medication to try to endure those inadequacies that we all felt.
The goal of centralization was to make the Mi'kmaq self-supporting, but within a decade, welfare rates quadrupled. Indian Affairs had hoped a university would take it on as a sociological experiment. Academia didn't study it, but Ethel Johnson lived it, life suddenly under control of the Indian agent.
We're 125% powerful. So everything they did, or that we were told to do, or I guess we just followed along. They made all the rules. But what could you do? They burned your houses down. You couldn't go back. You had to start from scratch again.
So what is this recording that you're going to play?
This is about centralization. I recorded my dad. Well, I cried the first time I heard it because I didn't even know I had it.
Johnson recalls sharing a house with 3 other families when they first moved to Eskasoni. She takes a photo down of her father, Roddy Gould, the voice in the recording.
But my mother got sick. I don't know if it was from the cold, and she was pregnant, and she developed TB. So we had to go to the residential school. That should be in their curriculum, in residential schools. Those two things should be in their curriculum, especially centralization. Especially both of them, I think, really are very important, because I went through two of them.
Coming up after the break, what happened to a claim for damages put forward in the 1970s? And what is the impact of centralization today?
High rates of diabetes, high rates of suicides, poverty.
Reserve of Maliguach was abandoned after centralization, and then when it was reclaimed by Unamagi communities. I'll take you to a cemetery where my ancestors are. I have a passion for it. I wanted to build my home there. Over the years, I've talked about it and dream about it. My ties are there because my parents came from there.
A loss of connection to land. Indian Affairs quietly ended its policy to centralize the Mi'kmaq in 1949, but Maliguage was already deserted, and Eskasoni was under pressure.
I think the centralization was like a shock treatment, but delayed. It took a long time before it hit us.
Ernest Johnson was 6 years old when his family moved to Eskasoni during centralization.
Mi'kmaq people have began to lose their dignity. Their own way of life was turned around, and they began to follow what was designed for them, and eventually to almost total dependency.
For lovers of history, the Dominion Archives is the realization of a collector's paradise, for within these walls are many priceless documents pertaining to Canadian events, dating from the 16th century to the present time.
Indigenous people would find it fascinating to look at records that pertain to their community. It's extremely time-consuming to even identify what records you would want to look at. Having the records available is one thing, but having the resources to access the records is completely another thing.
Lisa Patterson combed through the archival records for her master's thesis she wrote in 1985, the most in-depth research on Indian Affairs policy of centralization.
For here the administration of the nation is carried on under the watchful eye of the...
The initial goal of the federal government was to save $200 a year by cutting down on the number of Indian agents. In the end, the policy cost $1.2 million.
We're trying to explain this as if it's all rational, as if it makes sense. It didn't make sense. The contradiction that you have to protect and assimilate right from the get-go doesn't make sense. I'm frustrated because had I been able to afford to do a PhD, I'm sure that my master's thesis would have become a book, and I would have done a PhD on relocation schemes in general in Canada, because there isn't probably a province or a territory in Canada that hasn't had a form of relocation or centralization inflicted on them.
The Inuit living in the high Arctic were forced to relocate in the 1950s. The federal government later compensated the Inuit, a $10 million fund for the families impacted.
Money helps, but an apology even is that much better.
That apology came in 2010.
On behalf of the Government of Canada and all Canadians, we would like to offer a full and sincere apology to the Inuit.
In the early 1970s, the Union of Nova Scotia Indians was laying out a case for Aboriginal title and a claim for damages for the cultural genocide of the Micmacs of Nova Scotia during centralization. But since then, the issue of relocation seemed to fall off the radar.
We were concentrating on what happened to centralization. Why weren't the Native people compensated somehow for being moved from one reserve to an isolated reserve like Shabanaidi or Eskasoni? But nobody's really ever pursued it any further than that.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. Maybe there's other fish in the sea that we're after.
The Nova Scotia chiefs are at the table with government negotiating treaty rights. Centralization isn't part of the current conversation.
Maybe we should resurrect it. I mean, you've got day schools now. You had residential schools. Now you have Indian day schools. So maybe that's next.
To me, centralization then is very difficult to talk about it in isolation, because we see that as many ways that the government has used to eradicate or to kill that Mi'kmaq spirit that's been in us. I honestly and truly believe that psychologically, spiritually, and even cognitively, we have not recovered from that yet.
A few studies have measured the impact, noting a decline in traditional activities and a rise in alcohol abuse from the economic and social breakdown. The 1996 report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People writes, centralization was doomed to failure, and it took a heavy toll before finally being abandoned. It served to disorient and demoralize 3 generations of our people. A 1998 internal document for the federal government ends with questions for future research like, did the branch mismanage the process? APTN obtained a copy of the report, but the federal government has not made it available to the public, and Mi'kmaq leaders we asked were not aware of it. Today, there are 13 Mi'kmaq bands spread out over 42 reserves in Nova Scotia. Many resisted relocation, but about 1,000 Mi'kmaq were uprooted, and decades later, Eskasoni remains the largest Mi'kmaq community.
The reason it's the largest because of centralization. Is it a good thing or bad thing? We're still dealing with poverty today. You know, overcrowded of housing, high rates of diabetes, high rates of suicides, poverty, 70% child poverty.
Leroy Denny is the chief of Eskasoni.
We're doing our best. Don't get me wrong, we're doing our best. You know, we have the highest graduation rates in our community. Very smart. Our young people are very smart. They're getting well educated. Majority of our teachers in our community are Mi'kmaq, right? So we're battling back because we know our elders, they went through a very dark period of time. And they remind us they don't want their next generation to go through what they've been through.
I think that's when they introduced this idea of centralization, and
it's part of the curriculum here at the high school in Eskasoni. Elders Bessie Prosper and Ernest Johnson talk about what it was like.
I think there was pure hell. Huh? You had nobody. But they began to develop what we call today dependency. When we came here, it's like going into a cell, your own cell. Like the word incarceration, I think that we saw what being incarcerated was about.
It was like my first ever time like hearing about it. It upset me because like I don't know, they made all these promises and then they didn't deliver. So then when we were fed up and the Mi'kmaq people were like, we're going to go back to where we live, they ended up burning down all the houses.
And it's important that we educate our communities. The people, the province need to know this story as well. You know, it's a dark history that can't be just put under the rug. We need a public apology, and that's what I'm seeking. On behalf of my community, we need a public apology and maybe some sort of compensation for the issues we deal with today.
Yes, apology is essential. But there has to be some action behind that apology. And I do hope that next 20, 30, 50 years from now, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
I don't believe in words. I believe in deeds. And if I can see an apology in action, then I'd be for it.
There's a lot of reconciliation that needs to happen, and I think that would be an important part. It's been left out. It's not talked about anymore.
An apology or compensation won't turn back the clock, but Stephen says it's an important chapter in Mi'kmaq history, one that people should know about. Her own path towards reconciliation leads back to Malagawach.
I don't know what I would call it, a passion, I guess, for the small community that my parents left. And my grandmother is buried there, and my great uncle. So whenever I go back there, I get a bit emotional. I always say a few prayers for them, and I feel their presence. That's how strong this place is for me.
The house her mother used to live in collapsed a long time ago, but she remembers her parents returning to see it when she was a child.
It means a lot to me to even stand here and look at that same spot where the house used to be. I just feel like all my ancestors are here, watching over me, and including my parents. So yeah, it means a lot. Even just to be here today and to be doing this, I feel honored.
Done